My father instructed the waiters to remove the extra plate for my son. He said, "We don't seat strangers at our family table." My son quietly pushed back his chair and walked away. But my fiancé stepped forward, raised his glass and said something that made my parents gasp. The plate hit the waiter's tray before anyone had even unfolded their napkins. My father did not look at me when he said it. He did not look at my son either. He just pointed at the place setting and told the waiter to take it away. He said, "We do not seat strangers at our family table." That sentence landed harder than anything he had ever yelled at me growing up. We were at one of those restaurants where everything is quiet on purpose. White walls. Heavy doors. A private room my father insisted on booking because family matters should stay private. The table was set for 8 polished glasses, printed menus, name cards placed exactly where my mother wanted them. One of the cards had my name. One had Brian's. There was nothing for Evan. Evan noticed immediately. He always notices. He slid into the chair anyway and looked at the empty space in front of him like maybe the plate was coming late. When it did not, he looked at me. I was still processing what my father had just said. The waiter apologized to no one in particular and lifted the plate. No one stopped him. Evan pushed his chair back slowly. He did not cry or ask why. He walked out of the room like he had practiced disappearing before. I stood up and asked my father if he was serious. He said this was a family dinner. He said he agreed to meet my fiancé, not play house. He said bringing a child into this without discussion was inappropriate. I reminded him that Evan is my child. My mother cleared her throat and said, "Let us not start like this." My sister stared at the table like she was counting scratches in the wood. My father leaned back and folded his hands, satisfied. That was when Brian stood up. He picked up his glass, not in a toast way, just enough to make everyone look at him. He thanked my parents for making their position clear early in the evening. He said it saved time. My father told him to sit down. Brian stayed standing. He said he came tonight because he was planning to marry me, and that meant understanding the family he was marrying into. He said he needed to know how they treated a child who already loved them without conditions. He gestured toward the doorway Evan had gone through. He said, "Now I know." My mother inhaled sharply. My father told Brian he was being dramatic. Brian smiled and said maybe. He said, "But I am also prepared." That was the first time I saw my father hesitate. Brian said there was something he needed to share before dinner continued. He said it was relevant. He said it explained why he was not asking for anyone's blessing tonight. My father laughed once and told him to get on with it. Brian placed his glass down and looked directly at him. And whatever he was about to say, I could tell from my father's face that he had not expected it. Brian said he should explain why this dinner mattered more to him than it probably did to anyone else at the table. He said when he was 9, his mother married a man who believed blood decided value. He said family dinners were a test you failed before you sat down. He said there was always a chair that was not really yours. My father interrupted him and said this was not about Brian's childhood. Brian nodded and said, "You are right. This is about mine." He said Evan has already been through enough adults deciding whether he belongs. He said tonight was the first time Evan was meeting the people who would either be his grandparents or strangers. He paused and said, "You chose." My mother tried to soften it. She said things were moving fast. She said my father needs time. She said Evan will understand when he is older. Brian looked at her and said children understand more than adults think. He said Evan understood perfectly when his plate was taken away. My father leaned forward and said he would not be lectured in his own family room. He said Brian was overstepping. He said if this marriage was going to happen, boundaries had to be respected. Brian agreed. He said boundaries are exactly why he had not yet told them something important. He reached into his jacket and placed an envelope on the table. Not slid. Place. My name was written on it. Underneath, Evans. My father asked what that was. Brian said it was the reason we would be leaving soon. He said it was also the reason this dinner would be the last time anyone spoke to my son like he was optional. I felt my stomach tighten. I had seen the envelope before but I did not know he brought it with him. My father told him to take it back. He said private matters should not be aired like threats. Brian said it is not a threat. He said it is documentation. He said my mother might recognize the letterhead. He went still. Brian said when people treat children like inconveniences, they usually assume no one is paying attention. He said that assumption is often expensive. My sister finally looked up and asked what he was talking about. Brian said he would explain, but first he needed to check something. He asked my father a simple question. He asked whether my father planned to acknowledge Evan as part of this family at any point in the future. The room waited. My father said he would not be forced into anything. He said respect is earned. Brian nodded once. He said that was all he needed. Then he stood, walked to the doorway and called Evan's name. And when my son came back into the room holding Brian's phone, I realized this was not just a conversation anymore. Evan stopped just inside the doorway. He was holding Brian's phone with both hands like it was something fragile. Brian thanked him and told him to wait outside for a minute. Evan nodded and left without asking why. That alone said more than anything else. Brian turned back to the table and unlocked the phone. He did not rush. He said earlier my father mentioned boundaries. He said he agreed. He said boundaries protect people from repeating mistakes. He set the phone down and angled it so my parents could see the screen. It was an email thread. Old dates. Legal formatting. My mother recognized it immediately. I could tell by the way her hands folded together. Brian said before proposing to me he did something my father would probably appreciate. He said he did his homework. He said when a family puts conditions on love, there is usually a history behind it. My father told him to put the phone away. Brian did not. He said 10 years ago, my father quietly settled a lawsuit involving one of my sister's children. He said the case never went public because it was cheaper not to let it. He said the agreement included a clause about public conduct and family reputation. My sister's face drained. She told him to stop. Brian said the settlement also included language about future dependents. He said the family agreed to specific standards of treatment. He said those standards did not leave room for removing plates. My father stood up and told Brian to leave. Brian said we were already planning to. He picked up the envelope and slid it toward me. He said inside was a copy of the same agreement along with something new. He said if Evan was ever excluded or treated as lesser again, it would not stay private. My mother whispered that this was unnecessary. Brian said so was humiliating a child. My father said you are choosing this woman over your future. Brian looked at him and said no. He said I am choosing my future by choosing them. He turned to me and asked if I was ready. I did not look at my parents. I stood up, took the envelope and nodded. As we walked out, my father said this would have consequences. Brian stopped at the door and looked back one last time. He said you already chose yours. We did not go straight home. Brian said he wanted to give Evan ice cream. He said it like it was already decided, the way adults say things when they are trying to anchor a moment. Evan sat between us in the back seat, quiet but not withdrawn. He asked if he did something wrong. I told him no. I told him none of this was about him. He nodded like he believed me, which hurt in a different way. My phone started buzzing before we even left the parking lot. My mother first. Then my sister. Then my father. I did not answer any of them. At the ice cream place, Evan finally smiled. He told Brian he liked how he talked to Grandpa. Brian said sometimes grown-ups need things explained clearly. Evan accepted that and focused on his cone. When we got home, the messages were waiting. My mother said my father was humiliated. She said he felt attacked. She said families handle things internally. She said I had put her in an impossible position. My sister's message was shorter. He asked how Brian knew. I did not respond. Brian waited until Evan was asleep before opening the envelope again. He spread the papers on the table and explained what he had done. He said when my father started asking pointed questions about timelines and custody early on, it felt off. He said people who worry about control usually have something to lose. He said the agreement was real. He said my father violated it the moment he singled Evan out. He said legally we had options. I asked him if this was revenge. Brian said no. He said revenge would be public. He said this was protection. The next morning my father showed up at my door. He did not bring my mother. He did not bring apologies. He brought anger wrapped in concern. He said Brian had crossed a line. He said threatening the family was unacceptable. I told him no one threatened anyone. I told him he embarrassed a child. He said Evan is not his blood. I told him blood does not decide who I protect. He looked past me into the apartment like he was searching for Evan. I stepped into the doorway and blocked his view. He told me I was making a mistake. I told him I learned from the best. He left without saying goodbye. 2 days later my sister called again. This time she was crying. She said our father was furious. She said he was blaming everyone but himself. She said the agreement Brian mentioned was being discussed again. He asked me what I wanted. I looked at Evan building something on the floor. I looked at Brian making dinner like this was just another weeknight. I told her I wanted peace. She said I do not think he knows how to give that. I said then he will finally understand what it costs. The consequences did not arrive loudly. They arrived politely. My father called Brian first. Not me. Brian told me about it afterward like it was just another detail worth noting. He said my father sounded calm. Reasonable. He said that tone my father uses when he thinks he is regaining control. My father said the dinner had gotten out of hand. He said emotions were high. He said maybe words were misunderstood. He said families survive by not dragging everything into the open. Brian asked him what he wanted. My father said he wanted things to go back to normal. Brian asked what normal meant for Evan. There was a pause long enough that Brian remembered it later. He said my father finally answered that Evan would be treated kindly but appropriately. He said boundaries would remain. Brian told him that was not an answer. He said Evan does not need kindness that comes with fine print. He said he would not raise a child to feel tolerated. My father said Brian was making a mistake. He said he was willing to forget what happened if Brian stopped pushing. Brian told him he was not pushing. He said he was standing still. The call ended there. 2 days later my mother came over alone. She brought old photo albums like they were proof of something. She spread them out on the table and showed me pictures of birthday cakes and school plays. He said I was loved. She said my father just struggles with change. She said Evan would be included if we gave it time. I asked her a simple question. I asked if she could promise Evan would never again feel like he did when his plate was taken away. She did not answer right away. She looked down at the photos instead. That silence was louder than my father had ever been. The following week my sister called. He sounded tired. She said my father was angry at everyone. She said the old agreement Brian mentioned was being talked about again. She said lawyers were asking questions my father did not like. She asked me if all of this was worth it. I looked at Evan on the floor building something crooked and proud of it. I looked at Brian making dinner like this was a normal night. I told her yes. Then the invitation arrived. A handwritten card. Formal wording. A dinner invitation at my parents' house. No private room. No exclusions. My mother had added a note at the bottom asking us to please bring Evan. I held the card for a long time. It felt like an apology written by someone who was not ready to say sorry. Brian asked me what I wanted to do. I said I wanted Evan to never wonder again where he stood. Brian said then we do not test that. I declined the invitation. An hour later my father finally texted me. He said I was choosing a man over my own family. I told him I was choosing a child who did not get to choose any of this. He never responded. Weeks passed. The silence stretched. Stopped feeling heavy and started feeling clean. And somewhere in that quiet, I realized the revenge my father feared was never about contracts or consequences. It was about him losing the ability to decide who belonged. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned out slowly like fog you do not notice lifting until you can suddenly see again. Months went by without my father's name lighting up my phone. No holidays, no obligatory check-ins, no sudden apologies disguised as concern. My mother sent one message on my birthday. It said she hoped I was doing well. That was it. No mention of Evan. No mention of Brian. I replied with a thank you and let the conversation end there. Life kept moving and it did not wait for them. Brian and I got married on a weekday morning at the courthouse. Evan stood between us holding the rings and took his responsibility very seriously. He asked the clerk if he should practice first. Afterward we went out for burgers and fries. Evan told the waitress he was the best man and asked if that meant he could order dessert twice. That night felt more like family than any formal dinner ever had. A few weeks later, Evan asked why we did not visit my parents anymore. He asked it casually, the way kids ask things they have already partly figured out. I told him sometimes adults decide love comes with rules, and sometimes they do not like being told those rules hurt people. I told him it was not because of anything he did. He thought about it for a moment then said okay and went back to building something on the floor. Brian watched him for a long time and said the quiet part out loud. He said people like my father do not fear confrontation. They fear becoming irrelevant. About a year after the dinner my sister called. Her voice was lower than usual. She said our father's health was not great. She said he did not talk about feelings but he asked questions. He said he asked how I was doing. She said he asked whether Evan was doing well in school. She said he never used Evan's name, but it was obvious who he meant. She asked if I would consider calling him. I remembered the empty chair, the plate sliding away, the way Evan walked out without making a sound. I told her not yet. A few weeks later, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a small wooden box. Inside that was a child's plate. Blue rim. Little stars around the edge. Evan's name written neatly on the back in my father's handwriting. No letter. No explanation. No apology. Just the plate. I sat at the table for a long time holding it, trying to decide what it meant. Brian asked if I wanted to put it out. I shook my head and placed it back in the box. I put the box in the closet, not hidden, just not displayed. I said belonging does not work retroactively. You do not take a seat away and offer it back when it becomes inconvenient to stand alone. Maybe one day my father will say the words that matter. Maybe he will not. Either way, my son eats every meal at a table where his place has never been questioned, never negotiated, and never earned. And that is the ending my father never saw coming. Father never saw coming. Father never saw